In just the 5-year period between 1991 and 1996, we saw the release of the greatest collection of video game soundtracks in history. Super Mario World, The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past, Sonic the Hedgehog, Donkey Kong Countries 1 and 2, Super Metroid, Earthbound, Secret of Mana, Final Fantasy VI, Chrono Trigger. I don't think it would be controversial to say that what we think of as video game music was defined and refined during this period, in the same amount of time that it took between releasing Skyrim's Legendary Edition and Skyrim's voice-controlled Very Special Edition. So it's kind of no wonder that Skyrim composer Jeremy Soul's first ever game soundtrack, Secret of Evermore, released in 1995, has flown under the radar for a lot of people, myself included. While it's a hidden gem, it really is a gem. The music is dark and moody and just dripping with atmosphere from front to back. Let's take a look at some examples from the soundtrack, break down the techniques they use to create such a thick atmosphere, point out some pretty clever writing along the way, and maybe convince you to give the soundtrack a listen if you haven't already. A big factor in the atmosphere of each of these tunes is the heavy use of reverb. Writing music for the Super Nintendo wasn't quite as limited as the previous generation of video game hardware, but composers still had to get creative to add effects to the sounds they wanted to use. A common technique to simulate reverb on an instrument was to take the channel you wanted to put reverb on, copy it note for note into another channel, then make it a little quieter and delay the timing a little bit. The two channels together created the illusion of one instrument with a little reverb on it. In the track Hall of Koloja, of the 8 sound channels available on the Super Nintendo's hardware, 5 of them were dedicated just to adding reverb to the instrument tracks. We have this repeated harp figure in 7/4 time outlining an E Dorian sound, a quiet choir pad holding bass notes, and a breathy flute melody. This is 3 channels. The harp is given 1 extra channel to simulate reverb, and the melody is given a whopping 4 additional channels delayed at varying degrees to create a tidal wave of sound. That flute sounds like it's being played in the back of a cave. It's amazing how big of a difference this effect makes to the atmosphere of the piece. It's no wonder pretty much every track from Secret of Evermore uses this technique to some extent, though Hall of Koloja was the most extreme example I could find. Besides the liberal use of reverb, one key compositional element used to create the game's atmosphere is sitting on A minor for an extended period of time. I'm only half joking. A lot of pieces from the game feature drawn-out segments that stay on one chord, the lack of harmonic motion allowing the listener to settle into the music in an almost meditative way. The Castle of Black theme sits on an extremely pretty A minor chord for just about the entire piece. The chord is voiced with the flat 13th and flat 7th tucked underneath an A minor triad, with the 3rd and 5th moving back and forth with the 2nd and 4th, to create some sense of motion without the chord actually changing. This repeated vamp features every single note of the A minor scale, or A Aeolian mode, which captures the somber sound of the Aeolian mode and gives tons of weight to the relatively simple A minor melody that plays above it. The track Queens and Despair does feature a more elaborate chord progression, but it sets the tone from the beginning with this repeating guitar figure moving up and down from the root to the 3rd of an A minor chord underneath the simple descending melody. This piece is not in any hurry to go anywhere, and taking its time on this A minor sound really gets at a sense of hopelessness that runs through the entire piece, even when more chord changes do come in. The game's credits music uses the same kind of atmosphere right off the top, with this 8th note piano line winding around an A minor scale underneath these breathy choir pads. The harmony once again allows us to sit and stew on an A minor sound, the droning repetition of the 8th note rhythm and cold sound of the piano drawing a feeling of futility out of the Aeolian mode. Aiding the atmosphere of the piece is the reverb channel layered over top, copying the piano part but displaced by one full beat to create this great, wide, echoing sound. A similar technique is used farther in when the music takes a brighter turn. A nice melody comes in over top of this classical guitar accompaniment, which uses the colorful major 7th and 13th of the underlying C chord, while also moving the top note of this 3-note figure around to support the melody and evoke the C Lydian mode. This repeating 3-note figure in the guitar part takes up 3 channels worth of space, each note getting their own dedicated channel so they can each ring out over the others until the next repetition of the figure. Simulating the way the strings ring out on a classical guitar, a much warmer sound in comparison to the earlier piano line, combines with the brighter turn in the harmony from minor to Lydian to create a sense of rest and relief. A sense that gets knocked on its head when we dive into the following E minor chord. Probably the most interesting part of this track, though, is the final section, where we get this repeated move from an F Lydian sound to an E minor 9 chord. Take a listen and see if this reminds you of anything. Did you guess it? This is the exact harmonic motion that was featured in Chrono Trigger's iconic Secret of the Forest, as well as in a bunch of other places around Chrono Trigger's soundtrack, which was released just 7 months before Secret of Evermore. Now, I'm a big believer in parallel thinking when it comes to composers, but this chromatic flourish in the melody, moving from this D note to land on a B note over the E minor chord, seals the deal. This is a clear homage to Yasunori Mitsuda's work on Chrono Trigger. The fact that these games were released so close together, though, means that for this homage to even be possible, either Jeremy Soule had a very quick turnaround to get his soundtrack out, or he had an early peek at Mitsuda's groundbreaking score, thanks to both games being developed by Squaresoft. Either way, I love the clear reverence this reference shows for Chrono Trigger's music. This Secret of the Forest vamp pairs up 2 chords that don't fit together into a single key or scale, in this case alternating an F Lydian sound with an E minor one. This approach is another way to create a sense of atmosphere, way on the other end of the spectrum from our earlier examples. Either you sit on one chord forever, or you change keys at the drop of a hat. The City of Ivory theme starts in the key of E flat minor, setting the mood with a classic rising fifth line cliché a la James Bond. The melody is a very simple exchange of ideas, repeating figures but altering the notes to trade between E flat minor chord tones and chord tones of the 5 chord. But these note choices, while basic, are carefully placed to create dissonance against that rising fifth line in the accompaniment. When the fifth, B flat, moves up to a C flat, the melody hits a B flat or an F to make a major seventh or tritone interval, both very crunchy options. And against the step up to a C natural in the accompaniment, the melody's move to a G flat gives us another dissonant tritone rub. Clashing with the harmony like this gives each melody note an edge, imbuing the piece with this sense of something sinister lurking around the corner. But just as quickly as the mood was set, we shift away from it, from the key of E flat minor to E minor. The same melody is bumped up a half step, but the harmony brings forth a new approach. Rather than continuing the James Bond chromatically rising and falling fifth, we start on an E minor chord with the flat 6 included and move the root by step up to the flat 3rd and back. This E minor flat 6, which could also be spelled as a C major 7 over E, feels like a half step shift up from our original key of E flat minor, but it also shifts smoothly into a C Lydian dominant chord at the end of the phrase, as all of the B naturals move down to B flats. And this leads into a longer section based entirely on the C Lydian dominant scale. The C Lydian dominant scale is a great sound, one of the few scales that sounds great just being played up and down as a scale. It's a mode of the G melodic minor scale, and so it feels totally natural when we walk down to a G minor 6 sound farther in. This G minor 6 pivots to become the minor 4 chord, resolving first to a D major chord in second inversion, and then cleanly to D minor, establishing yet another new key. The piece ends with an extended D minor section which uses lots of diminished chords to shift to a slightly more pretentious minor key sound. This very last chord of the loop is so slick you might miss it. The spread D minor voicing that the section ends on is tweaked just slightly, these A notes dipping down to A flats and the root dropping down to a B flat to transform this D minor chord into a B flat 7, which smoothly transitions us back to our original key of E flat minor with a 5-1 cadence as we return to the top of the form. So all in all, we started in E flat minor, moved to E minor, pivoted to a C Lydian dominant sound, shifted to the key of G minor, and then closed off with a section in D minor, all inside a minute and a half. There are lots of examples on the soundtrack of this sort of meandering key shifting, moving farther and farther down a rabbit hole before one very logical shift brings us right back to where we started. The City of Ebony theme creates a floating, dreamlike atmosphere by constantly shifting keys, but not in a disorienting way. The piece maneuvers through each key shift smoothly, tying one to the next in a way that sounds totally pleasant. We start on a G chord and cycle through a series of perfect fourths, from G to C to F to B flat to E flat to A flat, before resolving up to B flat to end the phrase. This feels like a series of 1 to 4 movements that all dovetail together. Any 3 chords in a row will fit inside one key, but the chords on either side of any 3 in a row will always include notes that break out of that key. Rather than a key change that happens at one definite point, this approach gradually pulls you through each key, drifting along in a dreamlike haze. The melody facilitates the key fluidity with simple triadic structures, targeting notes that can carry over from one key to the next. You'll notice how naturally the melody leads to the third of each chord as we move through the progression, landing on the note that most strongly identifies the chord in question. Toward the end of the loop, we shift to a more aggressive chord progression. We start on a minor chord, then jump up to a major chord a tritone away, and then move that sequence down in whole steps. These are pretty rough shifts, but they're softened by the melody. We start on the root of this minor chord and then jump up to the third and then the flat seventh, a dramatic but not uncommon melodic figure to use. It just so happens, though, that the flat seventh of this first minor chord works as the third of the following major chord a tritone away, and this acts as a pivot note that resolves down to the root of this second chord, smoothing out the grit of the tritone leap as much as possible. For an example that combines harsh harmonic twists and super smooth voice leading, the Castle of White theme creates an atmosphere with a palpable sense of foreboding. We start off with a moody 3/4 vamp sliding between an A minor add 2 chord and an A flat minor add 2 chord. The melody follows a simple but effective structure, ending on this nice enclosure resolving to the third of the chord and then repeating the phrase with the ending bumped up to an enclosure resolving on the root. Only the second phrase is transposed down a half step to fit the change to A flat minor. So while structurally it kind of sounds like a satisfying conclusion, it also has a bizarre, unhinged quality to it. This creepy feeling is accentuated by the sound of the added second to each minor chord, a potent sound adding a sense of danger to the music, and this continues in the following section that moves between G minor add 2 and A flat minor add 2 chords. Then the piece moves into a series of completely bizarre chord movements. An F Lydian sound for 4 bars, to D flat 7 for 4 bars, to B flat Lydian for 4 bars, to G sus for 4 bars, resolving to a longer C Lydian section. These 4 chords have seemingly nothing to do with each other, but the voice leading makes the movements work. Specifically, this piano line here. Over each of the minor chords in the first half of the piece, the piano part alternates the second and third of the chord, accentuating that gut-wrenching minor add 2 sound. But watch how this line moves as we continue through the following chords. Moving to this F chord, a chord a minor third down from the previous A flat minor, this piano line simply moves up a half step, from B flat and C flat to B and C. This gives us the sharp 4th and 5th of the F chord, accentuating the sound of the Lydian scale, which resolves in the following bar to the 3rd and 5th. When the chord shifts to D flat 7, rather than the B to C figure we expect, the piano moves to B to D flat, or C flat to D flat to be technically correct, outlining the flat 7th and root of the chord. This alternates with a bar of C flat to E flat, moving up to hit the 9th of our D flat 7. This E flat smoothly drops down by a semitone to land on a D natural for the following shift to B flat, winding around a figure that also highlights the Lydian sharp 4th of that chord, and it seamlessly dips down a step as the chord shifts to the final G sus. This line weaves between each chord, always finding the most painless way forward and tying everything together into a sensible progression even though the movements are so chaotic. The harmonic twists and turns are exciting, always keeping you guessing, and they take you on an emotional journey. From the sinister opening to the unmoored feeling of the middle section, through the brighter and more curious wandering progression towards the end. But there is a consistent atmosphere through that whole journey that's immediately identifiable as sounding like Secret of Evermore. Video game music has changed a lot in the 30 years since Secret of Evermore and its contemporaries came out, but still this music feels just as moody and clever as it did back then. I want to give a huge thanks to patron Jason Uloa for requesting Secret of Evermore's soundtrack. If you'd like to join Jason in supporting what I do with this channel, please consider donating to my Patreon too. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one.